Well, thanks so much, Klaus, and thanks for everyone joining us and for your interest in this topic today. I'm Chris Lee. I oversee mergers and acquisitions and corporate venture capital for a company called Palladium, which is a 3,000-person services firm focusing on the social sectors, so issues like public health and global health. My background is in the financial markets as a banker, investor, government official, and as a researcher. And the last decade or so, I've really been focusing my attention on attracting capital to underserved markets, and that's what drew me to SHIP and to volunteer my time here. I've been very thankful and privileged to have been a part of this, and especially thankful to my co-lead, Patrick Brennan, with me here from AdvaMed. Patrick, if you want to say a few words of introduction before we get started.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. Pleasure to be here with everyone today. Look forward to the discussion with you all. I'm Patrick Brennan. I'm Vice President with AdvaMed Excel. It's a division of AdvaMed for small and mid-sized companies in the medical device diagnostic and digital health space. So we work to engage those small companies in our policy and advocacy work, but also provide a lot of education and guidance to our member companies in regulatory, reimbursement, compliance areas. One of our priorities at AdvaMed is looking at issues like this and addressing pediatric innovation. So we're very excited to be part of this and pleased to be here with everyone today at this workshop.
Great. And I think we'd be remiss if we didn't, extend thanks to the broader team here of folks that have been involved for 12 or 18 months as volunteers, helping to identify the right questions, debate these questions, and ultimately prepare for this session. Our core team is listed on the left side here, many of whom you'll hear from later on today as part of the panel. On the right side, we just warm thanks to CPATH, who has been organizing the entire workshop, and of course the executive committee and the coordinating committee, who has done a great job of connecting these independent work streams to one another, so we keep reimbursement in our minds, we keep hospitals in our minds as we, as the finance team, think about the numbers behind those things. So just extending thanks to the broader team here for their energy. And before we dive into the financial aspects, I wanted to reiterate the purpose of this overall initiative to ensure we're all on the same page. And this mission statement, in essence, says that we're trying to stimulate investment and innovation in pediatric devices. And there are lots of things embedded within that statement. SHIP-MD's role vis-a-vis stakeholders across the system, how it leverages the infrastructure that already exists rather than recreating it, what sort of operational implications and reimbursement and regulatory implications are brought about through the model that it will undertake. And so, as we talk through this today, through a financial lens, I just want to keep everyone focused on, the bigger vision here of where we're trying to get to as an initiative. And, in terms of where we are versus getting to that phase where SHIP-MD is achieving that mission, we see three phases ahead of us. One is where we are right now. This is the conceptualization phase where, volunteer work groups have been trying to suss out some of the value proposition questions, the key considerations that an initiative as ambitious as this will need to undertake, ultimately resulting in this workshop where we hope to get some really constructive feedback that will then take us into phase two. Phase two would be a more formalized consortium phase where all this feedback and all this knowledge, all these questions that we've been surfacing would ultimately get synthesized into a strategic plan for the SHIP-MD initiative. And that would be, kind of a 1 to 2 year effort. Ultimately, that would lead us to phase three, which is the implementation phase of SHIP as a standalone entity, again, kind of in the world, doors open, working against that mission statement that we identified up front. So with those phases in mind, with those mission statements in mind, we were tasked with looking at the financial dimension of this. And overall, our focus in concert with the other work streams was to think about how SHIP progresses from where it is today to where it's supporting itself financially. And underneath that overarching question, there are a host of sub-questions that you'll see listed on the page here that we've been deliberating against for the better part of a year. What is the best organizing construct to design and implement initiatives like this? What are the most plausible operating models and funding sources to support those operating models for an initiative like this? And what are the critical financial issues that we need to keep in the front of our minds as a strategy ultimately gets developed? We have not created the strategy. In this process, we've identified the key issues and some hypotheses that need to get tested during a strategy process during the second phase of this development. So this is what we've been deliberating as a volunteer group for the last year. And ultimately, here's where we have come out from a key points perspective. Funding is, of course, going to be required to get us to advance through each of the phases that we've identified. Again, from the phase we're at now into a more formal consortium phase to the point where we are raising funding for SHIP itself and to the point where it becomes operational. It's our view that the most likely sources of funds for most of these phases will be grants, either from the public sector, the private sector, or a mix thereof, with the added caveat that a public grant may require some legislative action and mandates. Once you get to the point of SHIP becoming operational as an entity, it, of course, will need to be funded. And at that stage, we imagine a couple other doors opening for SHIP to make itself sustainable. The first is going to be fee income, where innovators that are availing themselves of SHIP services will be charged fees for those services. Now, in the early stages of this, the number of innovators likely coming through the system, the likely cash resources they have available to them to pay for SHIP services, signals to us that grants are going to be the bedrock of how SHIP operates in its early years until it can get to more of a scalable place in the market that's maturing and its developing track record. Over time, you can imagine SHIP approaching other sources of funding, whether that's concessional or impact-oriented investors, or whether that's the commercial bank market to provide working capital lines against contracts it has with its innovators for services. But again, that's sort of down the track and supposes that we get to a reasonable scale as an entity. As an entity, therefore, it's our belief that to become successful, it needs to have a number of key attributes. And here's where I'm on the second main bullet. This freestanding entity needs to be independent. This is a systems level intervention and role. And so no single institution or set of institutions, should exert, kind of undue influence on this initiative. The second is that it should be nonprofit in its orientation. Thinking back to the mission statement, SHIP is meant to absorb risk as an independent catalyst for medical device innovation. And so that role, coupled with the commercial reality of these projects, signals to us that a profit maximization mandate is infeasible and inappropriate for the problem we're trying to solve here. The third key attribute that we mentioned is on sector-wide participation. Again, this is a system-level initiative, and so having the voices of patients and patient groups, hospital systems, payers, investors, innovators, etc., all need to be kind of well structured and voiced and participatory throughout this process. And lastly, we believe it needs to be focused on advisory services at its beginning stages. Again, providing advice to innovators to expedite their journey through the innovation and the regulatory process. Beyond that, there are a couple key design issues that we planted as items here for the strategy process. One is a belief that SHIP MD should not hold ownership interests in the innovators' companies or their products. And this is for a number of different reasons. First is the real and perceived conflict of interest that could entail by virtue of the fact of SHIP's role across the system that could call into question kind of SHIP's overarching mandate and mission and role. And similarly, on the demand side, as we look to attract the venture capital community, the angel investment community, the philanthropic community to these innovators, the value proposition changes to the extent that SHIP is an owner or participating economically in these projects. So we would advise against that at this stage. That said, the last bullet point here indicates a hypothesis for discussion that the role here is to try and attract venture capital, angel investment, philanthropic, public funding to these innovators projects. And if SHIP MD's services are insufficient to de-risk and be compelling enough to unlock those sources of funding for innovations, down the road, we do feel that a separate entity that will be providing funding is something that could be considered. Now, if that were to occur, it's sort of common practice in the financial markets that the funding entity would need to be managed wholly and separately apart from the advice-giving entity. And so you'd, in effect, have two distinct bodies of work here. But that is something that we foresee as a possibility as we get down the path with this initiative. And so with those key points in mind, let me take it over to a more graphical depiction of that and just reiterate a few points before going to my panelists and to Patrick. So where we are now is in the pre-consortium phase, which was funded by a $230,000 FDA grant. That financing will take us through this public workshop and the summary report that will result from it. The next stage of that, presuming that there's a quote-unquote go decision, will be to run a formal tender process for a consortium operator to develop the strategic plan. You see in the middle of your page, the consortium becomes operational later this year and into next year. And of course, that process will need to be funded, again, likely by grants. Simultaneous with that, you see in the middle of the page that as the strategy develops and comes into focus, the startup costs for SHIP itself will need to be funded and invested in order to become operational. And then as you get to the right side of the page into the future, in C, SHIP is then generating revenues, from fees that it's charging its innovators, from grants that it's sourcing from the foundation and the public, and it's incurring expenses. At the same time, you'll note that above the red line in that page, the consortium is still operational at this point. And this can be, really seen as the mechanism by which the broader system interacts with SHIP as an entity. SHIP itself, of course, will have a management team. It'll have a fiduciary board and a governing body that attends to it as an entity. But as we talked about before, the industry, the public sector, patient groups, et cetera, need to have a voice and advice on the direction of where SHIP is headed. And this consortium is the mechanism that we see as the best way to accomplish that at this stage. At the bottom of the page, the fourth financial component of this is the investments that the innovators themselves are sourcing to their projects. And you'll see that too exists under another red line, indicating that SHIP itself, at least in its first stages, will not be a funder of innovation. It will be an advisor to innovation. And so it's our hope that through its role in the center, it can act as a sort of small b broker of capital. It can act as an advisor, as a convener, et cetera, to make those transactions easier, but again, would be separate and apart from CHIP's operations itself. It's not meant to be a venture facility at this stage. So with those summary points in mind, I want to sort of open up to my panelists on any key points that I may have glossed over before handing it to Patrick to talk through the details of each of these four phases. So let me turn it over to Patrick and open the floor to the few panelists that may have something to say here.
Thank you, Chris. Just pause momentarily for the other panelists if they have any comments or thoughts to add there. Okay, well, I think, just from my perspective, I just stress that, these SHIP as a freestanding entity participation would be voluntary, for the industry participants there. And, I think we've laid out here the different phases of how this would develop. So I'd like to move into discussing some of the specifics of the consortium and some of our key assumptions as we view the development of this consortium. As Chris said, through this process where we are now in the public workshop, we're gathering information, gathering questions, sort of fact-checking some of these assumptions and proposals that we've put forward here. And all of this information will be collected and then synthesized, and the consortium would be taking that and developing a strategic plan for that freestanding entity of SHIP-MD. And as Chris mentioned, again, providing that ongoing advice and guidance. So we feel that this, it's very important to have a multi-stakeholder structure for this consortium that would have an established governance model, again, with that multi-stakeholder participation. And then in terms of the funding, this would be specific for this SHIP-MD consortium. Would not be pooled or commingled with other sources of funds for other projects. It would be a dedicated fund for this. And as we have discussed, and we'll lay out in further detail, these would be from public grants, private grants, primarily as the foundation of that funding for the consortium. We would want to identify and select an organization to house this consortium in and operate this consortium. Again, this would be a multi-year effort. And so, we would suggest to go through a tender process to select that consortium operator, and that organization and the team that they would create around this consortium would develop that strategic plan that would be bridging this public workshop where we are today with the ultimate implementation of SHIP-MD as a freestanding entity. So we've also looked at ballparking a few of the costs around the consortium and, examining some of the annual costs, looking at other models, and looking at the possible funding models as well. So as you can see here, we've laid out just a sample annual budget with primarily looking at some of the staff support and the resources that would be needed to run the consortium. On the right-hand side there, you can see some of the different examples, and again, we'll come on to these in a little more detail momentarily, but these are some of the examples that we've examined of other multi-stakeholder consortia and their funding models. And, oftentimes you see here a blend of funding from private and public sources. Those that are health-minded projects, public sources tend to require that specific legislative mandate, and we had called that out earlier in the executive summary. And I think as we are operating here in the pediatric space, there's certainly a host of private foundations and other philanthropic groups that would be interested and likely to support this type of initiative. I think it's important to note, though, as we look at this consortium and consider it, a strong bridge to that freestanding entity, but having a life of its own as that entity has stood up. We want to look at sustainability and consider the funding sources as these are subject to grant cycles and annual or periodic renewal. So just to examine some of the different models and the timeline, again, this sort of maps back to that graphic that Chris presented. You can see the different phases and the evolution of SHIP-MD. We are, again, recommending that this consortium be a public-private partnership. There are a number of organizations out there that have operated consortiums or are freestanding consortiums themselves, and we've listed a few of these here. And we through the exploration process of this work stream, we examined some of these. You can see then the public grants and philanthropic grants that would support the consortium. For the seed funding, as we've sort of estimated this to be around $2 million, this would be a blend of again, public and private sources of funding as well, with there's public and private grants, but also industry participation through possible membership fees or direct grants into the SHIP-MD at that seed funding stage. And then in terms of that operating model and some of the financial structures there and the different benchmarks that we looked at, again, I think it's important to stress here that this would be an independent, and again, going back to that governance structure of the consortium, would be ensuring that independence, and a not-for-profit organization with multiple stakeholders participating. There are a few good examples that we can refer to here. I think notably the Institute for Advanced Clinical Trials for Children, similar effort on the drug side, provides a good model for this. There are other efforts. Excite International on an international basis looks at market access and payment issues primarily, but brings together multiple stakeholders in that arena, as well as industry participation to advance clinical trials and market access. And then there are more local models, such as the Health Tech Arkansas program that was an interesting example of hospital participation in clinical trials and working with innovators to spur the uptake of new technologies within a specific health system. So within these operating models, again, you can see there the different funding sources. Consider some of these, that revenue stream for the ongoing operations of SHIP-MD. We've talked about some of the fees that may be for innovators to receive the services and the access that SHIP-MD would provide. But again, there's that underpinning of public and private grants is important to note there. So this just, again, continues on with a little bit of a look here at some of the specific numbers that we've considered. And these are a hypothesis, if you will, but it's conceptual and maybe provide a model to take into that strategic planning. So I won't read through everything here on the slide, but I will draw your attention here to the far right-hand side. And again, just bringing us back to the mission, we feel that this really can catalyze investment capital in pediatric devices. The efficiencies and the access and the savings in time and cost that SHIP potentially could provide to innovators could help to spark additional investment capital for these companies. So as we went through this research and exploration of some of the operational and funding aspects of ShipMD, we identified a number of questions that would be priority for the consortium to address, and where we would like to receive some of your feedback here today, some of your thoughts on these questions, just in terms of the mandate and if the proposed operating and funding models that we've suggested here align with those mandates of the public grants and private foundations and industry participants as well. And then, a further refinement and definition of that value proposition across the ecosystem for a number of players. We've got a network of hospitals that would be involved, the device innovators, those that support and are part of that ecosystem, just to refine that value proposition and ensure that the operating model and the funding sources, again, align with that value proposition. I think we also want to consider, as the nature of the services become more clear and specified, we want to consider how that would then translate to the financial needs and the abilities of some of the innovators to pay for those services. There could be multiple points of entry. We've noted in the case studies some of the timelines for development and where ShipMD could come into play. So companies across multiple stages of development could participate in SHIP, and their financing needs will be different at those different stages, as well as their needs for some of the ShipMD services. So just to put a finer point on that and to make sure that we're staying in alignment there. Furthermore, the consortium would need to examine in some detail the expense and revenue profile of ShipMD, and understand where the majority of the expenses would be coming from, and have a plan to ensure the appropriate amount of revenue therefore to support those. We do feel that the majority of them would be from the staffing and consultants into ShipMD and creating the network. But there may be some other expenses, as we've identified here, potentially a data coordinating center. We've seen this in other consortia and other efforts around coordinating clinical trials and clinical research. Is that something that we would need to account for here? Are there other expenses that we should be considering? So we'd welcome the feedback from the group here today. Your questions and comments on some of these questions that we've identified that the consortium would focus on. So in conclusion, for this presentation portion of the session today, again, ShipMD, creating this freestanding entity would require funding at the different phases that we've identified. We're here in the pre-consortium phase of this public workshop today, but there would be funding, and there's been funding put into this up to this point, but there would be additional and separate funding required to establish and operate the consortium. There would be funding required to seed and operate the ShipMD as a freestanding entity. So just to reiterate those three phases of development through this process and the funding that would be required at each phase. We recommend again that the operator of the consortium be selected through a public tender process, and at that stage have that seed funding for the ShipMD as a freestanding entity in place. Conceptually, again, the participation in SHIP is voluntary from an innovator's standpoint, and this will not limit the innovator's ability to go out and execute other financial or strategic transactions. In fact, it will enhance that. Their participation with SHIP and the contract with SHIP would, stimulate additional investment, we would think. And importantly, sponsors retain their intellectual property. That participation in SHIP does not, necessarily mean that there would be any exchange of intellectual property or equity in the company. And again, as we've discussed here, there is the potential eventually for the development of a freestanding financial vehicle, a separate nonprofit entity that could provide investment capital to those companies that participate in SHIP. Again, if needed. We feel this is part of that catalyzation of investment capital into pediatric devices that brings us back to our original mission statement. So, and that concludes the presentation portion. Again, we're really looking forward to your feedback and thoughts on our propositions here and our outline of the funding and operating models for SHIP-MD. So, Klaus, I'll turn it back to you, and again, welcome our fellow panelists to chime in now or as we take questions.